Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the webcast, The End of Personality Stereotypes, the Pearman Personality Integrator, sponsored by MHS Assessments and presented by Dr. Roger Pearman. Your questions may be submitted anytime during the webcast by typing in the question in the Ask a Question text field. That is the orange button on your screen, and click Submit. Your questions will be answered at the end of the webcast. And now it's my pleasure to turn it over to our presenter, Dr. Roger Pearman.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. I'm so appreciative of the opportunity to talk about the Pearman Personality Integrator, and I look forward to questions that folks have or follow-up inquiries about the model and the assessment and how it can be useful for folks. As you can see from the screen, there are certification programs available, and you can see those described at the publisher's site, mhs.com/training. Also, if there are any tweeting activities, you see what the appropriate tags are related to the material that's going to be presented to all of you who are willing to spend some of your precious time with me today. And again, I thank you so much for you taking the time and for the sponsorship and opportunity to talk about a model and an assessment that I think are very, hopefully, going to be quite a contribution. You may know me from work I've been doing over the last 30 years in the exploration of personality, personality patterns, personality type, and leadership. I've been creating a whole variety of products, hopefully to make various concepts about behavior patterns practical and accessible to individuals. With the release of the Pearman, it's the most recent and integrated effort on my part to pull together key research findings and key lessons of experience related to the use of personality insights and individual effectiveness. So I thank you for allowing me this opportunity to talk a little bit about some of the key research findings I have around psychological type, and just to let you know what's coming in this webinar. I'm going to talk some about the findings in my work around demonstrated and natural use of various mental resources. We're going to take a look at those mental functions or mental resources as outlined by Carl Jung in a system related to perceiving and judging processes that each and every one of us use. I'm going to talk some about Jung's extraordinary proposition around subject-object relations and why that's important in development, and it's related in my mind and in the work that I've had a chance to do to the notion of flexibility. And of course, part of my hope is the outcome is that individuals see that there's a range of resources they can utilize in a more intentional way and not be captured by a particular pattern that can be constricting. Carl Jung made a whole variety of propositions about personality, and this particular proposition is one that I hold most dear in the work that I do, and it is really that by helping individuals develop the whole of who they are and the accessing of an array of their talents and gifts, that it is both hard work, it's a serious task, and it requires a level of conscious energy that in fact can be quite taxing. My hope is that the Pearman actually makes this an easier task to achieve, and also provide a framework to enable one to think about oneself in a very integrated way, and to think about oneself in the use of an array of resources that may not necessarily be so front of mind in the way in which people have traditionally thought of their personality patterns or personality type. Many of the the lessons that have gone into the creation of the Pearman Integrator really begins from a few critical moments which have been repeated actually over a number of times over the years. And in this particular case, I was working with an executive as a coach, and on his particular results, he had scores of an E of 5, N of 3, T of 9, P of 1. And those of you who are familiar with the MBTI or the Golden or the majors, you know that that's a typical four-letter code in the case of ENTP, and that there are numbers indicating how much you've selected that particular pattern or that particular preference. And this particular executive said to me, well, with those numbers being obviously low numbers, I really answered a lot of I and S and F and J questions, so what does that make me? And in the vision of traditional psychological type tools, there's no easy way to really answer that question, and it's an honest question, and it's a very fair-minded question of an individual who's cognizant that yes, I may have selected extroversion more than introversion, but of those things of introversion that I indicated, tell me about those. I may have selected more intuiting than sensing, but of those things of sensing that I selected, how might I utilize those? And yes, I did select thinking more than feeling. However, there were clearly a lot of feeling-related attributes identified, so how do those play out in me? And I have found over the years that as you talk to individuals and you explore their reactions to results, they very often will say, well, this pattern is one that's descriptive of me at work, but this is really not how I am. If you were to see me at home or talk to me at home, you'd find that there's a real different sort of pattern that I show up. And increasingly over the years, I've had people make the statement, in fact, just yesterday in a presentation I was doing with some managers, I had a whole bunch of them say, well, now hold on a minute, I want us to recognize that how I am at work is not inherently necessarily how I am at home. And so I felt it was important to create a personality tool that invited people to actually make that distinction, to talk about what is comfortable for them, what is natural for the way in which a person responds to various stimuli or situations, as well as what you feel you have to demonstrate. And in fact, if we read Carl Jung very closely, he was quite passionate about the notion that learning to adjust and adapt was very important, and understanding that sometimes that adaptation came with a personal cost and personal focus. And so I wanted to make sure there was an opportunity to really tap into the way in which people can indicate what's really natural for you and what's something you do very often. So on the Pearman Personality Indicator, as you see in the screen in front of you, an individual not only is not forced to just select one or the other, which happens in a lot of personality type tools, but an individual is invited to, using a slider bar, to give micro indicators of how comfortable they feel about doing a particular behavior, such as you see in this example, taking charge of a group, and how comfortable they feel in providing support, a supporting role in a group. Likely, how often do they do this? And by using this sliding scale, those micro indicators can be used for analysis in a whole variety of ways. And we'll talk about that in terms of how it shows up on the Pearman report in just a minute. Another critical event for me in 1991 when I was doing a leadership development program for the Young Presidents Organization, which is an organization of folks who built a company that sells $100 million a year, and the presidents, I believe, are under the age of 45 in order to be a part of it, be a part of the group. And as a part of the process, you are, as a facilitator, you're told that the group is very candid in their feedback, and that you need to be prepared for that feedback, and you need to hold all of the interactions as confidential interactions in terms of who said what, and how the event unfolds is one where it's a very intense and personal experience. While doing a traditional presentation on type, one of the young presidents stood up and made the statement to me that this seemed more like psychobabble to him, and he didn't really see how it was related to his ability to be effective. I called a pause and decided to do a reset, and I turned the newsprint pages such that I had a clean page. And as I did that, I had this recollection from Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, in which Jung made this statement that it is our type which determines and limits our judgments, and that his book, meaning Psychological Types, was an effort to deal with the relationship of the individual to the world, to people and things. And as a result of that quote, the more I thought about it, it led me on the newsprint to draw a stick figure, as you see on the left, and a series of figures on the right, and with a space in between. I invited the group to tell me, as you put energy out to motivate and inspire and to lead others, what are some of the things you do? And as they described their behaviors, I very intentionally grouped the behaviors into what I knew were the four key functions of type. I asked them, when you are reflecting on your interactions and you're being observant of what's transpired, what are some of the things you're thinking about when you're trying to lead and motivate a group? And again, I knew they would share things about their thinking and their reflections, which would group into the four functions of type. And so I had these big bubbles on what they focused on that was immediate, a bubble around logical debate and consequences, looking at patterns, how connectivity is fostered amongst the group they're trying to lead, and all of those being very evident things they put out, as well as when they're reflecting on data or analysis or thinking about scenarios and ideals that feed their decisions. And once we did that, I said, well, now let's come back and look at these behaviors and let me label them. And in the labeling, I invited them to see that, you know, when we look at energy in the outer world, we're looking at extroverted energy and what that extroverted energy is about. And when we are reflecting on things, and those reflections impact some choices that we do make and things that we're aware of, that's an introverted process. And immediately they could all see how the energy system was evident in terms of what is in fact happening in their interactions with others and what they're reflecting on in their interactions with others. And then they were invited to see the linkage between the fact that there's a perceiving process and there's a judging set of processes, and we were able to label those in terms of extroverted sensing behaviors and extroverted intuiting behaviors, as well as extroverted thinking and extroverted feeling behaviors, and then talk about the introverted reflections and the way in which those reflections played out. And as we did this, that same young man who objected to my traditional presentation of type said, well, why didn't you do this to start with? This makes a lot of sense, and it really speaks to the complexity of how I approach things and the things I reflect on, and helps me understand that there's a system of how we perceive and act on things that really I can see that my tendencies in the outer world and what I reflect on in the inner world impact my leadership with others. From that day forward, I've only been able to present type in this way, and I take a blank piece of paper when I'm talking to individuals, and I draw my stick figures, and I begin to talk through, well, let's talk about the kinds of things you actually do and demonstrate whether or not it's comfortable, but in fact you do. Also, the kinds of things you reflect on, and you know when your reflections are complete because you've covered a variety of sort of issues, and what do those look like. And almost always we're able to create the entire pattern, the entire system, and that leads naturally into the conversation of how that system is used. When I started working with psychological type many, many years ago, I kept coming across different lines from Jung's work, not only in psychological types, but in several of his letters, in which he makes the very clear declaration that his typology was not to classify human beings into categories. And in later letters, he said, I never intended for my typology to be seen as a characterological method, meaning as a fixed character of an individual, and that classification really wasn't his goal. Of course, you might well ask, well, then what was the goal? What is it he was trying to achieve when he provided the model of psychological type? And part of the answer to that question is really related to the subject-object conversation that we're going to have in a minute, because in fact, throughout psychological types, Jung makes statements that all of the functions can be conscious, and by the functions he means extroverted thinking and introverted thinking and extroverted sensing and introverted sensing and extroverted feeling and introverted feeling, that indeed the products of these can be in our awareness of how we can utilize these functions, and that we can in fact be attentive to what's under conscious control and understand that some things we utilize in a more spontaneous way, we might even say in a somewhat less conscious way. He makes the point that all of the functions, while present, may not have the same degree of strength or development within the individual, which, notice, he hasn't put this in a categorical way. He simply says that they don't have the same strength, they don't have the same development, but that doesn't necessarily mean that one is weak and one is strong. In fact, one could have relative to tap into. He says in one of his letters that later on, this was years in reflecting on type, that the attitude type is what he called extroversion and introversion, remains more or less consistent, and the function type, which he identifies as extroverted sensing or extroverted thinking or introverted thinking, is subject, he says, to all manner of changes in the course of life. And so paying attention to these additional observations of Jung and trying to think about how to construct an instrument that honored his observations led me to actually create the Pearman in a very particular way, and you'll see that when we talk about the report. A third key event that influenced my work around type and influenced the work that I wanted to do in the creation of the Pearman Integrator was some work that was an opportunity provided to me by the Center for Creative Leadership, which many of you probably are quite familiar with. CCL has probably the most complete database on the planet for looking at leadership patterns and leadership behaviors. And so I did an analysis of the data we had to take a look at all of the variations within the types. And it was quite evident that when you looked at those who were not doing so well as indicated by their 360 data and those who were doing exceedingly well by that 360 data, first of all, it was not type dependent. Doing well or not well was not dependent on a particular type. All of the 16 types as sorted by the MBTI could be grouped into 3 large buckets: those not doing so well, those doing okay, and those doing exceedingly well. And I was very interested on what was the key variable that seemed to be playing into how well people were doing. And I was reminded as I thought about it and as I teased through all of the data of Jung's notion of the transcendent function, meaning a psychological process that allows you to sort of collaborate within your own mental resources, and in the process of sort of thinking about what is the best way for me to approach or respond to a situation, it really required me to have a degree of psychological flexibility. And so I wanted to embed in the Pearman a whole deep look at the ways in which psychological flexibility, in fact, can be accessed and developed by an individual. So as we did this work, and I came to MHS with a whole array of items and factors, and we did a whole variety of studies, we saw that there were 5 critical areas that were essential to flexibility and agility. And one, of course, is being proactive, being able to think through the probability of the best choices, to have a handle on the idea that the problem I'm dealing with or the challenge I'm dealing with in the moment may require me to put my automatic pilot on hold for a little bit and to choose another response in that moment to be more effective. There has been just abundant evidence that composure is an essential component of a person's ability to flex. Our capacity to keep our emotional temperature under control is a vital function for us to be able to have the kind of flexibility we need when we need to choose a different response. In addition, connectivity, and that is really about having reciprocal relationships from which we learn from one another and from which we build a sense of support, is another part of flexibility. It's quite evident that we pick up a lot of information from having conversations with others and having opportunities to observe others and what they do, and in so learn an array of responses in situations that can help us be more flexible as the time and the circumstances allow. It is also evident that how we seek experiences and add insights from those experiences enrich our capacity to flex, and encouraging people to test out and explore various new behaviors is important in enhancing their overall future flexibility. It's certainly transparently clear that the ways in which individuals cope and rejuvenate is extremely important to being able to flex. If you don't have a lot of psychological energy to address a situation, you're always going to go to your automatic pilot, and you're not going to have the kind of restorative energy you need to move forward. And so being mindful of how we rejuvenate is very important to enhance flexibility. So it was important to me that we measure these key dimensions of flexibility, and we provide a way for an individual to get feedback on how his or her flexibility falls among a distribution of adults. And as you see here, this is in fact the page that reports the particular data from the Flex Index that's embedded in the Pearman Integrator, and you as a trained professional working with this particular information are encouraged to work with it in a variety of ways within the Pearman. There are 3 ways in which the Flex information is really important to explore, and that's finding the connectivity between flexing that a person may do between their natural behavior, what's really natural and comfortable for them, and what's demonstrated behavior, what they feel they have to show in the challenges in their day-to-day life. There's also how well a person flexes between mental functions. So if you are in a situation where you are automatically always in an extroverted thinking mode, perpetually critiquing and analyzing, it may well be that you are in a situation where the most important thing to do is to facilitate brainstorming and an open-ended approach to gathering information, which is a much more extroverted, intuitive kind of thing. And the question is how well you can flex between your automatic extroverted thinking to engage in that extroverted, intuitive kind of behavior. And it's very important that we learn how we can in fact become more flexible between the use of those functions. In a more complex and nuanced way, there is the flexing within the mental function itself, meaning not all extroverted thinking is exactly the same. There is what I would call a very simple form of extroverted thinking to a very complex form of extroverted thinking. Same thing with each of the 8 mental functions. Now, Jung referred to this as the moving from concrete to abstract, and as you look at his analysis of the role of the functions and what he meant by concreteness, he was really trying to describe what would be a sort of offhand, simple use of a mental function to a more complex, rich use of a mental function in understanding both the depth of your perceptions and the soundness of your judgments. Now, I mentioned earlier that one of my passions about creating the Pearman was to create an opportunity for the trained development professional, like all of the folks listening in today, to really leverage the insight both that Jung had about what he referred to as subject-object relations and the very key principle that Robert Kagan at Harvard has outlined in subject-object relations as a core aspect of our way of knowing and our way of developing as we move through our lives. And one easy way to understand subject-object relations is to say, well, if you are an extroverted thinker and you always respond out of that space without any thought, without any consideration of an alternative perspective, your psychology is subject to that extroverted thinking. When you can be cognizant that you are using an analytical thinking process in an extroverted way, and you can really consider whether or not that extroverted thinking, which is now an object of your awareness and is an object of your conscious choice, you are now using it in a more knowledgeable, knowing way. And it is my contention that when you read Jung's work, for each of the 8 functions, he was providing for us a way to understand the power of the function, because it can be a source of us being subject to them, especially the one that we rely on the most, that becomes the ground of our being, and the role and the importance of becoming more cognizant of it as an object, a potential resource for us to use. Here in Psychological Types are 2 statements he made that echo what I believe was his intent when he said, "My book is about the psychology of the types." And that's the reason why he didn't want to see it as a characterological, putting people in categories lens. that it was to invite a consideration of how one's mind, if you will, the reason why I said our type limits our judgments, perceptions and judgments, we get anchored, we become the subject of these preferred processes rather than coming to use them in the most dynamic and useful way. So the Pearman, which is the product that now has taken my insights and my processes into play, comes in a couple of report forms. One is what we might think of as the everyday workplace lens, and then there's the leadership lens, and there's a special report that links the Pearman to the EQI so that you can see how it is our personality patterns and our emotional intelligence as measured by the EQI plays in. So with the Pearman, you also get, as you see in any of the personality type patterns, the big strokes on extroversion and introversion and sensing and intuiting and thinking and feeling. However, there's some major differences in part one of the Pearman. Notice that in this particular example, we're looking at sensing and intuition. Unlike any other personality type tool that exists, on this part of the report, the individual gets not only what he or she voted, which you see as the letter, in this case sensing, both of what they said was very comfortable and natural, and what they said they demonstrate on a day-to-day basis. You also get to see where the person actually put the little marker. The average of all of the individual marker placements for both intuiting and sensing is listed, both in terms of what one said was natural and what one said was what the behavior is you have to do. And you'll see there's a little triangle which indicates the average placement in the norm sample for sensing, those with a sensing pull, and the average placement of those with a sensing pull in terms of what they said around intuition. So you have on this page a whole bunch of information, not only about what you said and from one process to the other, in this case sensing and intuiting, what you said about yourself in relation to a normative sample. And you find in the little box, the green box will always be for what's natural, the blue for always what a person demonstrates, a narrative statement. And what's important to know about that narrative statement is that that narrative statement changes depending on one's individual score. So you see here S51 in natural and S62 in demonstrated, and that's the score of sensing when comparing sensing to intuiting. The thing to understand is that score is a standardized measure of difference that the person has indicated between sensing and intuiting. And on the Pearman, if a person did 50-50, it would be called a blended interpretation, and the person would get a blended indicator and a blended narrative. As that score changes throughout the tool, the narrative changes, and in that way an individual gets a chance to see how the nuance of their self-description is reflected. In another part of the Pearman, after you've had a chance to look at the flexibility scores, which we saw a moment ago, you actually get all 8 psychological functions as outlined by Jung. You get a chance to see what you said, the average placement that you gave on every single set of items related to each of the functions. What you said is very comfortable for you, and what you said you tend to demonstrate and show to the world. In this case, you see all of the extroverted functions. On another page, there's all of the introverted functions. In the way in which a person feels he or she is accessing those processes and utilizing them. Now, for the professional user, there is another special report that comes with the Pearman, which has to do with what we call the coach's report. And it's a very rich report that covers a whole array of data points that you would want to know. So in this particular example, you see that the person has took 12 minutes to complete the assessment. As we get more norms, there will be more norm regions that one will be able to choose from to see how the scoring patterns shift, the norm types, how those may shift. You see in this example in part 1 the response distribution. The green bar shows you the full range of placement of the icon through all of the items with an average score of placement on the icons, which you see to the right. And then you see the blue bar, which is much more narrow, indicating the range of placement of the icon on the demonstrated behaviors. And you also see there's an omitted category, and in part 2 there's a response distribution, and part 2 has to do with the Flex Index, and so you get a chance to see whether or not there's an overly positive response or a somewhat negative response pattern in the way a person was responding to the Flex questions. The other thing I love about the coach's report is that you actually get every single item and every single placement that a person gave on the item, so that when he or she asks a question about how their score turned out in a particular way, you can actually go to the items and have them take a look at how they distributed their responses so that you can give a very true and direct interpretation of how they've responded in their use of this array of psychological resources. One of the reasons for this richness is driven by my real passion for achieving something Jung suggested when he said uniqueness is an important part of who we are. And I wanted to make sure that in the creation of the Pearman and the reports used in the Pearman, that not only were we mindful of the kind of architecture of a personality, which I think we have with the 8 functions of psychological type, but also that we get a handle of the uniqueness of the individual. And one of the ways that that happens is being able to get micro descriptors so that when we look at how a person responds along that continuum, instead of selecting a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, we have the chance to actually, in long-term research projects now, we can actually begin to look at the nuanced behavior patterns and how those behavior patterns in fact play out in the way in which an individual feels he or she behaves and the way he or she engages those mental resources in their day-to-day life. So if you will, you'll note that the Pearman is, we've done a lot of work to try to make sure that we've covered age groups in the norming analysis, and so you see here when we talk about, in fact there were multiple research groups when we finally did the norming for the assessment and retesting and making sure the items and the normative distributions were robust. You see here the age group distributions that were a part of that research sample. We also looked at a whole array of occupational arenas. There were folks across a whole array of careers that were an important part of the research analysis. You also see that we worked really hard to make sure, as we analyzed and we took a look at the distribution of responses across the key mental operations or functions that Jung identified, that we in fact were getting a fair sampling of those processes. You know, one of the things that Jung wrote as he talked about psychological types, and he worried about how it was going to be used by individuals, he made the statement that these concepts in psychological types are meant to serve as a means of communication through what he considered colloquial language about very complex processes. And he speculated, of course, that the behavioral products that we see and can observe are byproducts of the use of these psychological resources that he believed was about the way we utilize things on our cortex. And today, Jung could have only dreamed of the kind of measurement that we have today, of being able to actually map how the brain is working under any given particular set of tasks or processes. And one of the researchers who's been looking at this in detail is Dario Nardi out of UCLA. And he's been doing a whole variety of research and publications as he's taken a look at the way in which the brain, meaning how the cortex is being utilized by individuals. And you see here on either side of the figure that's considered the cognitive skill sets of the cortex, the neocortex, dark lines indicating active use and indicating direction or directional frequency of the use of networks. And what Dario has discovered is that it is the 8 functions where there are distinctive patterns that, while all of the cortex is obviously being used, what is really getting, if you will, hot, as you see here by the various colors, what tends to be cooler, and the sequencing tends to vary by type. Now, I've used some of Dario's research, and I've also used some of his material, and have been absolutely ecstatic at the power of self-report when people are identifying their behaviors and how it seems to align with their cortical, actually measured cortical activity, which really affirms the role of self-report in tapping into the way a person sees who he or she is and how they tend to operate in the world. And I know in my own work, I'm working with Dario on a variety of projects that I'm quite eager to see if, in fact, the evidence will continue to support that when we look at the 8 functions and we look at the complexity of use of those functions in day-to-day process, we can be more cognizant and mindful of how we use those, and the kind of elasticity that's present for us to access more of those resources for greater satisfaction and fulfillment in our work and in our relationships. You know, Jung made the comment that only at the beginning of life, in the early years, is there a kind of linear movement, that the rest of development is really a moving around a center core self. And it's increasingly, I'm impressed by the idea that he had in mind that we could become more conscious and mindful of the resources that we have access to and use those in productive and constructive ways. You know, Suzanne Crook-Gruder, who's another developmental specialist who has been thinking deeply about how development can occur, and her quote here, which comes from the 9 levels of increasing embrace, is a quote that, for me, really speaks to the potential power of something like the Pearman, where we can invite a person to become cognizant of how their habits of mind and heart play into their challenges, how they can learn more from being attuned to their own mindfulness, and instead of a negative evaluation or a non-evaluation, if you will, of resources, that they can become focused in the now and choose among those resources for greater satisfaction. Now, you may know from your use of the EQI that MHS has a whole array of folks available to help individuals who'd like to learn more about the Pearman and how it can be used. There are different parts of North America that are divided out for particular individuals who you can work with. As I mentioned at the beginning, you can email me if you have questions from today's presentation. I'm happy to get your inquiries from any questions that you might ask. Please know that I'm happy to refer you as well to a blog that I have, Pearman Personality .blogspot.com, where I'm continuing to develop these ideas and materials and giving people, if you will, additional insights and examples as to how the Pearman can be used. And so I always like to leave room in these presentations for questions that people might have from what I've offered and suggested, and to see if there are particular items I need to revisit from what I've tried to suggest to you in the 50 minutes that we've been together. So let me look and see at some of the questions and see if I can get those answered for you. There's a question: does the Pearman include options to include 360 perspectives from coworkers or other relationships? And at the moment, the Pearman is a self-report tool. It is not in a 360 format. Another question is, can the Pearman Integrator be used for screening candidates for employment? And there is no evidence, because it's a new tool, that it can be used in that way. It's been my focus throughout the creation of the Pearman and the text to be very attentive to developmental framework. There is no doubt that people will use the Pearman probably in a process where they want to get people's responses to questions and then to use those as further exploration of their experience and talents. But the design of the tool is really to foster development and to foster growth. But we'll see as the years go along and as people do research how it will get used and how it could well be used in a circumstance whereby you've already made a decision to hire particular candidates, but you want to clarify how to launch them in the most effective way in their careers. I can see where it will be used there in some very meaningful, productive ways. Can flexibility be the reason why some assessment results are ambiguous or neutral? I'm not sure I entirely understand the question, but let's see if I can give you some additional information. A person who may not be very flexible, or who has, if you will, a hole in their flexibility, they're not very proactive, so they're not doing a good job of anticipating possible responses or choices, or a person is not attentive to restoration and rejuvenation, and therefore their emotional energy is drained more often than perhaps they like or are comfortable with. And what may well happen is, if you're not particularly proactive or you're not particularly restorative in a very intentional way, is that you may not have had the kind of experiences that would have prompted you to think about your behavior and how comfortable you are with that behavior. And so that might result in a somewhat neutral set of responses. Could impact whether or not a person was sort of ambiguous in the way in which he or she responded. So there is certainly the case that as you look at flexibility, you might, in fact, find a lot of answers to some of the ways in which they responded to the other questions about themselves. It's my view that as you look at flexibility, there will be cases where you need to start with the flexibility scales and setting the frame for interpreting the Pearman to have people get a handle on the degrees to which they feel they're flexing and utilizing these resources. You can imagine a case where a person, let's say, doesn't feel particularly comfortable being focused on details in a very long-term sort of way, and yet they're in a role that requires them to do so. And as they look at that difference, they become cognizant of what a strain that is for them. Well, imagine two people who have the same strain, but one who is very proactive and has a lot of ways of restoring their energy, and who's fairly connected to an array of people and know how to utilize folks, versus one who doesn't. Find a very different set of insights that an individual may well bring to their circumstance or their situation. So it is my hope, anyway, that the Pearman with the integrator component and the 8 functions component will give a person a chance to begin to see that there are each and every one person wears, if you will, a coat of many colors. And sometimes we need to accentuate certain colors for various reasons, and sometimes we need to flex. And in fact, our capacity to flex and our ability to access an array of psychological resources will be essential to dealing with the challenges that we face in a complex society and in a complex working world, which more than ever before requires of us greater flexibility and tolerance and patience, which sometimes some of us just have to learn to develop a greater sense of. I see there's another question. Well, it could be. A person has asked or made the observation that an individual who had an MBTI result could be confused if the results were different. And in fact, we've done a multiple set of studies, and overwhelmingly, in terms of the big sweep around ENI, SNN, T, and F, the correlations are extremely high in the 0.9 range in terms of how people come out very similarly. You may remember that the J and P scale of the MBTI and the other now type-related tools that are out there was a creation by Myers to actually tap into the use of the functions. It was her goal to, for example, an INTP was in her pattern an introverted thinker who extroverted intuition, which is to say, the very functions Jung had identified, she was tapping into with her 4-letter code. You could do the same with the Pearman insofar as that was important to an individual to, in fact, with very few questions, you can sort the J and P component of what a person extroverts or what a person introverts within their code. So there's not likely to be much confusion, though there could be from time to time. The thing is, though, the two tools approach personality type from very different assumptions. In many, many cases, the MBTI is the pattern, the tool, the sort of information that an individual needs for whatever level of self-awareness they may be at, and I think that's great. I certainly have been using the MBTI for over 30 years. There is, however, more to the story, and until now there hasn't been a way to tap into the richness of that whole story. And I would suggest that individuals who might be clear about their full-letter code and pattern probably could gain a great deal from understanding more about the engine that's at work that Jung articulated. He made it clear that our ability to increase and enhance our perceptions was directly related to knowing your use of 4 portals of perception, and how well we made decisions, and the soundness of our judgment was tied to how well we in fact could see a decision from the multiplicity of perspectives that the 4 judging functions can provide. So my hunch is there will be lots of professionals who, having used the MBTI with the audiences, want to take the conversation a bit deeper and richer around the use of psychological type resources, and they will do so. There will be some who will not want to venture there, and I celebrate the self-awareness however it comes for those individuals. I also, though, felt that it was very important to build on the research of the last 30 years and to say that, you know, there's a next part of the story, and that next part of the story really is around the range of flexibility as well as the use of all of those resources. And I can see that I have run out of time, and if there are additional questions that have come in, I will be more than happy to respond to those and invite you to communicate with me should you have additional questions. And I'm going to turn the presentation back over to Kathy.
Well, thank you so much to Dr. Roger Pearman for presenting this webinar today, and thank you to MHS Assessments for making this happen. The archived webcast and the slides will be available on the HR.com site within 24 hours. You can find it located under the archived webcast listing page. HR.com and MHS appreciate your feedback. Please take a minute at the end of the webcast to complete the evaluation survey that will appear on your screen. Thank you for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of your day.